For centuries, in San Marino, history has been told mainly through stones, laws and institutions, much less through printed words. While elsewhere, newspapers, news sheets and periodicals contributed to shaping an increasingly broad public opinion, the Republic remained on the sidelines of this process, held back by prohibitions, diplomatic prudence and limited resources. Telling life in San Marino, sharing information and discussing openly was neither a task taken for granted nor an easy one. Yet, when the press arrived, it did so very strongly. Through brief but intense attempts, satirical newspapers, political papers, cultural experiments and pioneering initiatives, San Marino slowly began to develop its own voice. A voice that travels from paper to the airwaves, from radio to television, and finally to digital media. In this episode of The Oldest Republic, we retrace the history of journalism and information in San Marino, a history of forced delays, enthusiasm, experimentation, and, above all, the desire to tell the story of a small republic in an ever-growing world. We'll tell you all about it after the theme song. Welcome to The Oldest Republic. I'm Federica. Join me in this adventure. Enjoy the episode. While in most of Italy, as early as the 17th century, news sheets, gazettes, and the first periodicals began to circulate, in San Marino the press did simply not exist, not due to a lack of interest or cultural vitality, but for a very practical reason. Printing was prohibited by law. For centuries in the Republic, it had not been permitted to own or use printing presses. It was a prudent choice dictated by the fear of creating friction with neighboring Italy, especially at a time when newspapers and pamphlets were often political tools capable of spreading uncomfortable ideas and stirring up tensions. The paradox is evident if we look at what was happening outside San Marino. In Italy, as early as the 17th century, news traveled by post, gazettes multiplied, and cities such as Venice, Florence, Milan, or Genoa became actual centers of publishing. During the 19th century, journalism experienced impressive growth. Major newspapers were founded, new professions emerged, and an increasingly broad and informed public opinion took shape. San Marino, on the other hand, remained on the sidelines of this transformation. The first turning point came much later, in 1879, when the ban was finally lifted and the first authorized printing house in San Marino, owned by Giuseppe Angeli, opened. This is a fundamental step. From that moment on, the Republic could also begin to print, discuss, and debate on paper. To tell the truth, before that, there was only one exception, almost clandestine. A political refugee managed to print a small newspaper in San Marino using a portable printing press. It was a simple paper, just a few pages long, but full of meaning. It spoke of independence, national unity, and republican ideals. It was a brief experience, but the attempt was very symbolic. This is a sign that even in San Marino, there was a need to inform and be informed despite a context that made it difficult. Following the opening of the first printing press, San Marino's first newspaper was published on the 9th of April 1881, a newspaper with a curious and ambitious name, La Nefelo Cocchiglia. The reference is cultured and explicit. The name recalls the fantastical city imagined by the Greek playwright Aristophanes, a place suspended between heaven and earth, founded by those who no longer recognize themselves in the world as it is and dream of something different. It is a clear allusion to a desire for renewal. The newspaper is small, just 4 pages, and distributed free of charge, but the tone is immediately decisive. From the very first issue, it chooses satire as its main language, targeting politics and its protagonists with biting irony and animal metaphors. Its founders are fully aware of the limitations of the venture. They stated clearly under the headline, The newspaper will only be published when it is possible to do so. And indeed, after a second issue published at a cost, 2 weeks later, La Nephilococcygia closes down forever. But the seed has been sown, and a few weeks later, again at the Angeli printing house, a second newspaper is born, Il Giovane Titano. The name says it all. The tone changes, less satire, more direct engagement. It is a newspaper that wants to speak plainly, address citizens, and take a stand. In its opening editorial, Il Giovane Titano openly declares its principles. Republican spirit, focus on the present, rejection of empty rhetoric, and nostalgia for the past. It is not a biased newspaper, but a space for debate, capable of criticizing without insulting and supporting what works. A small group of editors gather around the project, some of whom have already collaborated on the first edition. It is a small, almost family-like environment, but animated by enthusiasm and a desire to participate. However, this adventure is also fragile. Il Giovane Titano is published irregularly, gradually reducing the number of issues, and after a few years, it ceases publication. In total, just over 20 issues. However, the most important fact is that within a few weeks, San Marino goes from a typographical silence to lively journalistic experimentation. The first newspapers are born, try and fail, but they demonstrate that there is an audience, an interest, a need for information and discussion. From now on, journalism in San Marino will no longer be an exception, but a presence destined to grow. It is indeed after its first pioneering experiences, which were brief but significant, that San Marino journalism attempts to take a step forward. In 1881, a new periodical is launched with an explicit title, La Repubblica di San Marino. It is a monthly political and literary magazine with a clear objective: to preserve and spread the memory of the Republic. Its pages feature historical articles, civic reflections, news about institutions, but also ambitious cultural projects, such as the idea of national poetry competitions and a future Academy of Sciences and Letters. It is a newspaper that looks to tradition, but also seeks to build a modern cultural identity. However, this experience also does not last long. After just over a year and a dozen issues, publication ceases, but the excitement does not die down. The following year, a particularly interesting initiative is launched, the Circulating Popular Library. It is not a newspaper, but it plays a fundamental role in disseminating information. In addition to lending books, it also provides citizens with Italian newspapers, which can be freely consulted on site. It is a surprisingly advanced project for its time. The library is open to everyone, including women, regardless of income or cultural background. It is a small sign of democratic openness, showing how access to reading and information is perceived as a civic value in San Marino. It will actually be the 20th century that will change journalism in San Marino. The press is increasingly becoming a political tool. Numerous periodicals linked to different parties, movements, and ideological currents are launched. Every political force feels the need to have its own voice, its own newspaper. Socialists, Republicans, Catholics, Communists, Fascists. Over time, all of them use the printed press to spread ideas, mobilize support, and describe reality from their own point of view. Newspapers often change their name, frequency, and orientation following the transformations in the country's political life. For a long time, however, San Marino also continues to tell its story through others. In the absence of a stable generalist press, news from the Republic is mainly reported in Italian newspapers, thanks to local correspondents. Famous Italian newspapers, such as Il Resto del Carlino or L'Unità, closely follow San Marino's political life, especially in times of crisis, such as in 1957, when the so-called Rovereta events, which we talked about in the third episode of the podcast, when the attention of the Italian and European media focused on the Republic of San Marino. The path of journalism in San Marino, therefore, is neither linear nor straightforward. It was born late, grew up amid difficulties and experimentation, and became closely intertwined with politics, just as politics is intertwined with radio and television. These two were off limits for a long time. An agreement with Italy, signed in 1953, committed the Republic not to install or operate radio and television stations on its territory. Things only began to change in the 1970s, when the phenomenon of free radio stations exploded in Italy, ushering in a new era of local news. In 1980, Radio San Marino is founded, a private broadcaster linked to the communist area, which operated for several years. Shortly afterwards, attempts are also made in the field of television, with brief experiments that were often doomed to failure, hampered by economic and regulatory constraints. The real turning point comes in the mid-80s. Tele San Marino was born from local entrepreneurs' initiative, creating the first entirely San Marino-based television news program. A news program produced on Mount Titano but broadcast by Italian stations. It is the beginning of something greater. The decisive step took place in 1987 with an agreement signed in Rome. San Marino finally acquires the right to have its own radio and television stations. This leads to the creation of San Marino RTV, which is still the national state broadcaster today. In the following years, radio and television broadcasts begin, the news program is launched, and San Marino enters the major international circuits, eventually reaching satellite and national broadcasting. After centuries of delays, prohibitions, and attempts, the Republic finally manages to speak for itself, no longer just on paper, but through the airwaves. The last story we're going to tell you in this episode could be said to have come to us directly by fax. In 1993, SI, San Marino Italia, was founded, a daily newspaper distributed via fax, an original idea which surprisingly anticipated what is to come shortly thereafter: information free from paper, fast, daily, disseminated through technology. The experience is short-lived, but marks an important transition. Meanwhile, news about San Marino continues to feature mainly in Italian newspapers, particularly in the Romagna region. Over time, however, some newspapers open offices directly on Mount Titano, expanding their coverage of San Marino news and helping to create an audience that is increasingly attentive to the political and social life of the country. It is in this climate that San Marino's first real newspapers were born. In 1993, San Marino began to have newspapers conceived, written, and published in the Republic, devoted almost exclusively to domestic affairs. Some last only a few years, while others managed to consolidate and endure over time. It is a sign that there is now a market for local information and a widespread need to tell it from within. With the advent of the internet, the landscape changes once again. The 2000s see the emergence of online newspapers, capable of providing real-time updates, reaching new audiences, and complementing rather than completely replacing print media. This marks San Marino's definitive entry into the digital information age, with all the opportunities and tensions that this entails. After centuries of delays and prohibitions, the picture is now complete. Paper, radio, television, the web. The Republic has finally found all the tools it needs to tell itself. The history of journalism in San Marino is filled with obstacles and drawbacks, but each step forward tells the story of a small republic moving closer to the possibility of speaking with its own voice. It is no coincidence that we have chosen to conclude this journey through the century-old history of San Marino with an episode dedicated to information.
In this sense, the podcast you have listened to is also an integral part of this long history. It is a different, more contemporary medium, but it stems from the same need that drove the first printing presses, to tell the story of San Marino, to make its past understandable, to give continuity to its memory.
This episode concludes the Oldest Republic project. We thank you deeply for following us throughout these 14 episodes.
That's all from Storia in Flanella. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for listening, for your attention, and for your curiosity. And until next time, goodbye!